like to welcome everybody here.
Are we on with the mic? There we go. So, yeah, welcome. It's great to see such a good crowd here. Welcome to the Prime Time at the BU Library. So Prime Time is designed to celebrate the experiences and the accomplishments of Bethel faculty, students, and staff. It's a collaboration between the Friends of the BU Library, Faculty Development, and other offices on campus. Most of their programs are recorded, and you can find them in the BU Digital Library. On Tuesday, November 15th, Faculty Excellence Award winner for service, Dr. Patty Paulson, Professor of Science Education, will share her vision around a personal God-given passion to empower by serving from below, those traditionally excluded from the STEM fields. Today we welcome Amy White, Professor of Social Work, as she presents Overcoming Colorblindness on the Path to a Beloved Community, which includes critical race theory as a framework for teaching strategies that transcend colorblindness. So let's all welcome Amy.
All right. Thank you all for being here. I see lots and lots of social work students here. Thank you for your support. And my colleagues. I also want to thank my husband. When I first started teaching 15 years ago, I used to practice my presentations a lot. So he's listened to lots and lots of presentations over the years. So thank you for being here today. All right. I've been working on my dissertation over the last, 15 years in reality, I guess, but specifically over the last year and a half. And those of you who are here who've engaged in that process, there are times when I feel like I'm in a cave and I have no idea what's going on around me. And so sometimes I have to pick up my head and go outside of my cave. And I was realizing as I was putting this together, there's a lot of information here and a short time to present it. So this is an attempt to present a small part of what I've been doing. I've been really excited over this semester that some of my colleagues have been presenting on related issues. Ruben and Leah Fulton have been doing a series on microaggressions. Other folks have presented some pieces of this already. So I appreciate that and those that will follow. I also want to say that I'm a social worker. I'm not a theologian, and so I'm presenting this from a social work perspective. I've been very interested since the very beginning of my career on understanding racial oppression and understanding what can I do about that, what can we as a community do about that, and thus was kind of the focus of my dissertation. My dissertation is, again, a broader piece of institutional racism, but this is just one piece of that. All right, so I'm going to start with just a couple of terms that you're probably familiar with, but just to kind of put us on the same page, and in case these are not familiar terms. A lot of the research that I've done is in the context of a predominantly white institution. And a couple of people have said, well, what constitutes a predominantly white institution? And what I found is that to be considered a PWI, it's that whites account for 50% or greater of the student enrollment. I believe at Bethel we're at somewhere between 12 and 13%, so we are definitely a predominantly white institution here. A couple other pieces of, there's a lot in the literature about predominantly white institutions, and that a piece of that that's important is that a part of that is a recognition of the binaryism and exclusion that happened prior to 1964 during the Civil Rights Act. So there's been a history in many predominantly white institutions of segregation or exclusion before 1964. And then another piece of that is within that historical context of segregation, predominantly white colleges and universities are defined and contrasted with those who are not predominantly white institutions. So in this case, Bethel is a predominantly white institution. A couple other things. I'm defining, race has lots of different definitions, and the definition that I'm using of race, and we're talking here about systemic and institutional issues, that race is a social construction. So what I mean by that, and what authors who use that term mean by that, is that race is not based on biological factors. Some of you have seen videos, or some of my biologists in the crowd may be aware that some of the work on genetics, we're far more alike than we are different in our gene makeup. So race as a social construction is not based on biology, but through the social interactions and meaning that we give race in our society. And that social construction impacts privilege and oppression. And I'm going to talk a little bit about privilege and oppression as sort of the flip sides. They go with each other, and one requires the other. Oops. Okay, another piece, and I'm going to put this together into talking about color blindness, but another piece that's important is the whole idea of cultural identity. So if race is a social construction, then it impacts our cultural identity, how we see ourselves. Every human goes through a process of cultural identity development. And I would argue that this takes place practically from birth. And this process is unique to each individual and looks very different for people of color versus people who are white. So we all have a cultural identity development process, but that's very different depending on if we're white or if we're a person of color. So when we think about cultural identity development, and many students who are here, you are at a developmental place in life where you are working through, in particular, understanding your own cultural identity, where that comes from, what it means, what it's meant in your life, what it means moving forward. And in a predominantly white institution, this is a more difficult process. Why do you suppose that is? Why is understanding cultural identity more difficult in a predominantly white institution? Anybody have any ideas? What do you think that might be?
People don't feel challenged. You don't challenge yourself.
Okay.
If everybody looks alike, you're not really challenging yourself with that, oh, I'm different.
Exactly, yeah. So I'll get into this in a little bit, but a lot of times those of us who are white find ourselves in lots of environments where we look a lot like everyone around us. And so when we're in an environment like that, we may not notice or be aware or be motivated to look at what's impacted our cultural identity. I tried to include a lot of resources within this, and I will share this link with those of you on C faculty or others who want it. I'm happy to send it to you. So I tried to put a lot of resources in here. One of them looks at, there's a lot of different models of cultural identity dependent on the cultural group that you're a part of. And so the website listed there looks at cultural identity development according to different racial groups. Another book that I found really helpful as I worked over the years to understand this is a book by Beverly Tatum, who's a black psychologist. And she's written a variety of books, but one of them is called Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And I think it has been really helpful for me to sort of understand cultural identity and how cultural identity affects our behaviors. And she writes about cultural identity both within black students as well as white students and other groups. Another book that I have found incredibly helpful in understanding these issues are a book called Racism Without Racists. And there are several editions of that. Okay. So, I want to talk a little bit about power and privilege. I got an email from one of my colleagues this week who asked if this was going to be a presentation where I was going to make people feel bad about being white. That may be the case, but I think it's important to understand the meanings of some of these issues if we're to engage in making a difference. So, many of you are familiar with these terms, power and privilege, but I just want to speak briefly to them. So when we look back to our social construction, society gives privilege to certain groups by assigning unearned over-advantages to some groups and unearned under-advantages to others. So privilege has to do with unearned over-advantages for some groups and unearned under-advantages to others. A couple other comments and then I'll give some examples. Privilege is often subconscious and invisible. One way to think about it, I'm working with our intro students and they've been reading and thinking about this issue, and it's complicated and hard, but one of the things they say is they do some reading and they say, well, it's like I don't notice it. I've never noticed it before. And sometimes I think one way to think about it is it's a part of the air we breathe. We may not notice it, but it's there and it's all around us all the time. So if we're not aware of it, that's part of what it is, the invisibility piece of it. The other piece is those who come from the dominant group or privileged group may lack lived experience with racism that can limit their perspective of race. What do we mean by that? What does that mean, lack lived experience? Our colleague who's in the University of Minnesota now, Dr. Leon Rodriguez, talked a lot about lived experience. And what I learned from him was that, or what I took from what he taught us, was that if we grew up in a predominantly white community and interacted with predominantly white people, we may not have awareness of how racism and oppression affect people of color. So I can go about my life and my work and my grocery shopping and going to my kids' schools and all of those things, and if those environments are predominantly white, I may never notice or pay attention to how there may be people in that environment who are experiencing oppression or discrimination. So having lived experience is, and I'll get to this in a minute when we get to the strategies, but having lived experience is finding ways to interact in more diverse environments and developing relationships with people from diverse backgrounds so that we have a better understanding of how racism affects people, how oppression affects people in many aspects of their lives. So if we don't have that lived experience, we have a limited perspective on race. And that's kind of part of having privilege, is we lack awareness. Also a part of privilege is that those from privileged groups are those who are able, historically and currently, those are the people who are able to define what social norms are. And so, everything from, if we live in this country, we're supposed to speak English, we're supposed to behave in a certain way, we're supposed to do certain things, and that has been historically defined by people from dominant groups or people from white groups of what behaviors are acceptable. Okay, so if we have a social construction that creates a group of people who have privilege, then the other side of that is that then there are people without the privilege, or people who experience marginalization. If there's a privileged group, then we have another group who experiences oppression or marginalization. And those two things go together. So if one group's going to have privileges in society, that creates marginalization for other. If one group uses resources and has access to resources, that limits the amount of access others may have to those resources. So the marginalization process creates barriers and prevents access to resources, as well as input into the decision-making process. One of the things that I think is important, particularly in a predominantly white institution, is who's at the table when we're making decisions. And so if we have a fairly small amount of people of color, then it's hard to have those voices in the various committees, in the various classrooms, in the various ways that we make decisions as an institution. And so that's one of the ways that we limit people's decision-making power. So it's important to think about who's at the table. I listened to a podcast of two women were talking, and they were saying in their institution, they're another predominantly white institution, similar to Bethel, and in their institution, they've made a habit of whenever there's a meeting where big decisions need to be made, they're saying, we're two white women making this decision. What other perspectives do we need to have when we're making these decisions? Or if it's a group or a committee, is it representative of all the voices within the institution? And if not, how do we create that within our decision making? And I think the other piece is access to resources. And we talk a lot about this in our social work classes. And that has to do with, we're post-civil rights, and so we no longer have segregation, but the reality is that there are resources that are available, people of color may not have access to them. So that can mean a lot of things. It can mean that when we look at things like owning a home or living in a certain neighborhood, people may not have access to realtors who can help them find an appropriate place to live. Lack of access might look at employment. There's been some research where they look at resumes, and a person's resume that has a very ethnic sounding name and a person who has more white sounding name, and you look at those two and they have exactly the same experience, education criteria. Oftentimes the person with the ethnic name is not considered in the hiring process. And I think that's just one of 1,000 examples of how access can be limited for people of color. All right. And then, so the idea would, sometimes a lot of people might think along the lines of, this is in the past, why do we have to keep worrying about this, and let's just move on. The reality is this pattern is historic, and it's been in place over time. And so the systemic oppression has been in place over time. And so some of our systems and institutions sort of perpetuate that dynamic. So it continues, because it's not about being individually racist or individually prejudiced. It's about the systems that were designed and continue to be designed, and there's not input by people of color to create change, and so the policies and procedures continue. And that's part of the systemic oppression, and it's part of what contributes to marginalization. Okay, so back to cultural identity. How does this process impact cultural identity? I wanted to include a couple of resources on this slide that might give you an idea of where, this is just a small piece, but an idea of where you might find out more. A couple of resources to better understand marginalization and oppression. Michelle Alexander has written a book called The New Jim Crow that is a very good one if you're wanting to understand systemic oppression. Also, Pedagogy of the Oppressed is kind of a classic work by Paulo Freire. And then to understand power and privilege, there's a really simple short article called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack by Peggy McIntosh. And that's a good place to start if you're not familiar with white privilege and want to better understand that. Tim Wise is someone who's done a lot of work in this area. I've seen a lot of his work on YouTube and other places, and he's written quite a few books on the topic. And then Paul Kibble, not sure how you say that, also has written a book called Uprooting Racism that has some, if you're looking for more of a basic kind of understanding, those can be helpful. All right. I want to talk a little bit about some of the barriers that we face when we're looking at colorblindness, or moving through colorblindness, I guess I should say. So, I think the most significant piece of this is that all of us have defense mechanisms, and those are wonderful things. Defense mechanisms protect ourselves, our spirit, and our mind from things that are difficult. And so that's a wonderful way that we were created. However, sometimes those same defense mechanisms that can sort of create a buffer for us or help us cope can also create a lack of awareness. And so it's finding a way to manage that. And often, I think those of us who come from dominant groups or privileged groups, we often respond to some of these issues with denial. And that might look like, it isn't really that bad, this isn't really happening, we live in a post-racialized society. So there's a lot of that, and you hear that and see that a lot in the news, in the media, in other places. The other part that's similar but subtly different is minimization. So the idea that oftentimes we blame people of color. We might say, oh, why are they making such a big deal? They're playing the race card, or they're getting all upset about something that isn't really that big of a deal. And so both of those things can have a huge impact on our relationships between people of color and white people. So I think we need to be really aware of those things and how we might move past them. It can be a common initial response, but then to take a step back and think, okay, I'm feeling really defensive, I'm feeling a lot of denial, how can I move past that? Or how can I get more information? And then this is a whole nother topic that I would love to see someone present on, but the whole idea of white fragility as a barrier to awareness. There's a great article by D'Angelo that talks more about white fragility, but I think that white fragility can create a barrier to being able to understand and move forward in our awareness. And basically, in a nutshell, white fragility just has to do with an emotional reaction that white people might have when they listen to some of these topics or try to interact and engage in some of these topics. And that emotional reaction sort of prevents them from truly understanding or having awareness. And that can look like tears, it can look like anger, it can look like a whole range of different emotional reactions. Okay, I want to move into talking a little bit about colorblindness and unpacking that a little bit. So one of the articles that I wrote has to do with really wanting to understand how do students who come from dominant groups and come from very non-diverse communities, how can they learn about privilege and oppression in ways that help them move through some of the barriers? So I've been thinking about this for a very long time and teaching mostly white students at Bethel as they sort of navigate this. And one of the things that I've found is that we often get stuck, and not just students, all of us get stuck in some of these barriers. And that can feel pretty awful. People can feel a lot of guilt and shame. And so the idea is that's okay, because sometimes those emotions are motivating, but how do we move through that? And so that's something I've been really thinking a lot about as I'm working on my dissertation, is how can I as an educator help students move through? How can I as a white woman in a predominantly white institution, how can I move myself through understanding? How can I support my colleagues? How can we work together to create a place that's more inclusive? And so I came across this idea of colorblindness as a significant barrier and where a lot of us get stuck. And so as I think about what does beloved community look like and how do we get through this barrier of colorblindness, just some ideas and thoughts of ways we can do that, both as individuals and as professors and as students. Okay. I had the blessing of being able to attend I've done several Sankofa trips. And I don't know if one is planned for the spring break, but often we, as an institution, have supported something called Sankofa. And it's a group of students who, this last year, we went and visited many Native American reservations and had the opportunity to learn from Native peoples. And we also Bethel has done Sankofa, where we followed the civil rights movement and visited lots of historical places there. And so I highly recommend it. Students, I highly recommend it. Faculty, it's open to faculty and staff as well. And I believe it's offered through campus ministries, so I'm sure you'll hear more about that over time. But I say that because one of the times I really was aware of this was the first time I went on one of the Sankofa trips. And there was a very sweet, earnest young student there who grew up with siblings who'd been adopted, who were not white. She was white, her parents were white, but her siblings were not. And she was really trying to wrestle with this, and she said something along the lines of, I don't see color. It doesn't matter. And the response she got from some of the students of color was they were angry that she said that and upset. And then she was really confused, like, well, why, I don't understand. I don't understand why that's not, something I should say. So just a little bit of what colorblindness is, some of the comments that people say that might indicate that they're in a place where they're experiencing colorblindness. We're all the same on the inside. My best friend in high school was black, or Latino, or Asian, or whatever. People are just people. I was raised to believe that everybody's equal and not to see color. People might say, I don't see color. Or we're all made in the image of God, why does it really matter? Those are just some comments that can be fairly common when it comes to color blindness. So what's the problem with that? Why is that problematic? Some of the themes or concepts behind how that continues to create barriers is the idea that I think as a society, many people believe that race is no longer an issue. A lot of people will talk about how we live in a post-racial society. We've had an African-American president for the last 8 years. things have changed. We have a lot of rules and laws and policies that make racism a thing of the past. And so I think that that's a fairly common perception, and particularly among those of us who are white. The challenge with that is it lacks awareness of the racial socialization process, or processes, I should say. That, again, if we go back to being from the dominant group, we get to decide if something's a problem or not, or we get to say whether something is challenging or not. And the reality is that that's not ours to say. It is not our role to decide whether racism is still an issue, or whether people still experience oppression in our country. And we also have to be aware of the socialization processes that are going on, both for people of color as well as for whites. And then I think the other piece of colorblindness is this idea that, well, I'm not personally racist. I was raised to be respectful of everybody. So racism is often seen as an individual problem rather than a structural or systemic problem. And so I think that last one in particular lends itself to this idea that race is no longer an issue. I'm not racist, my family's not racist, and so I don't think this is really that big of a problem. The problem is that it continues to exist within our structures and within our systems. Okay, so I want to talk about 3 different barriers to moving past colorblindness. So I see colorblindness sometimes as this roadblock that's really hard to get past. And so I think about a couple of different areas where we may be able to think about how to move past that. The first one is that there's a lack of awareness of one's cultural identity. And particularly this is true from those of us who are white. We may not understand that we have a cultural identity. I often hear things like, well, I'm a million different ethnicities, or I'm white, or I don't know, I don't really have a cultural identity. And I think one of the most important things we can do in this area is to do our own work, to understand not only our own ethnicity and what that means in our lives, but also to understand what whiteness is and how that affects us every day. Understanding our own ethnic identity and how that impacts our interaction with other ethnic groups. Intro students are here, and many of our intro students have done an activity where we actually have this book in the library. It's called Ethnicity and Family Therapy. And my reason I use it is it tries to address the main ethnic groups that the main ethnic groups in the United States or in the local area. So it looks at Irish people, and Scandinavian people, and Finnish people, and many different groups. And it looks at some of the cultural norms. It looks at some of the themes within those ethnic groups. And I really like that because for many students, it's the first time they've really thought about, I have a culture. My particular background is Norwegian, and so some cultural pieces to that absolutely affect the way I interact with people is I can be very stoic. I might be really upset and you might not know it. I might keep that inside. I was raised and socialized to not talk about problems and not talk about things that are uncomfortable. So that kind of really flies in the face of trying to work through some of these issues. If I don't talk about race because it's uncomfortable and we're not supposed to talk about things that are uncomfortable, that can create a huge barrier. And then if you contrast that with a group who culturally and ethnically is more expressive, and say they process verbally or they're very demonstrative or some of those other cultures, there's going to be a culture clash there because I'm going to assume that people are supposed to be stoic and quiet. Well, that particular cultural group comes from a place where they're supposed to express emotion, and that's part of life. And so we might make judgments about each other because of that. So I like that particular resource because it's a beginning place to understand one's own ethnic identity, and that matters in our who we are. Also, understanding whiteness, understanding whiteness as an ongoing developmental process. there are a lot of excellent models out there for groups of people in workplaces, in college institutions, in churches, in communities who are doing this kind of work. And I think there's a myth like, why would you do that in isolation? Because isn't that just perpetuating the problem? If I'm going to do that work with just white people, how is that helpful? So I think that in of itself can be a barrier. But I believe that a lot of this work needs to happen. We have a lot of learning to do as white people. We have a lot of things we need to understand, both historically and currently. And so this can be a process where we can really unpack that. And I've been involved over the last year with a group, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but the whole idea of this group is this white people doing work with other white people. And that benefits often groups of color or people of color because we're doing our own work and we don't have to put that on them. So often we might go to a person of color and be like, well, teach me about this, or tell me about that, or I'm feeling bad, so what should I do? We often might go to a person of color to do that. When the reality is we have to do our own work and have to teach each other and hold each other accountable. And the other benefit of that is then we're in a different place and we're more open and receptive to being a part of an institution that's more inclusive. But we have to do our own work first. It isn't just going to magically happen because we want it to. It takes a lot of work. And it's hard, and we have to push through that. We're not supposed to talk about it. We have to push through that. This is embarrassing, and I'm ashamed, and I don't want to do this. So having a way where we're sort of supported by others who are in that process can be really helpful. A couple other resources for that. There's a website called Untraining, which really looks at this issue and has all kinds of links and things you can do on your own or find a group that's doing that. There's a book called White Awareness by Katz that also looks at some of these issues. I mentioned White Fragility, that's an article. This is the group I mentioned. It's called SURGE, Showing Up for Racial Justice. I got involved with them over the summer. It's been very humbling. I think I did a sabbatical project around Black Lives Matters and the social movement and how that works and how can we support that. And the leaders that I connected with kept telling me, yeah, you should go to this one. Go to SURGE, basically very nicely, thank you, but go to that one. And I remember thinking, but I already know all that already. I feel like I've passed through and I'm able to sort of understand all that. What I very humbly learned was I'm always going to be learning, and I'm never probably going to get to the place where I really understand. And so this is a place where I can work with other white people to support social movements and to support racial justice work by doing my own work. Okay, so those are just some ideas for some of the ways we can work on this. I would love to see a groups at Bethel. We had racial reconciliation lunch groups at one point in time, and I found that incredibly helpful to keep learning and growing. If people are interested in, particularly faculty or students, in those kinds of sort of focused opportunities to learn and grow, I would really look forward to talking further about that. I think that can be really powerful and keep us going and getting through those barriers that we face. Okay, the second piece of colorblindness, or the second way that it can get in our way, has to do with the limited interactions that we may have with those outside the dominant group. If you look at the environments that many of us, and some of you have intentionally chosen to live, work, and interact in very diverse environments. But many of us came from segregated school systems. We go to segregated churches. Some people talk about church being the most segregated hour in America. We may work in a segregated or fairly segregated place or non-diverse place, or live in a very non-diverse community. And even if we do live and interact in more diverse communities, are we really interacting with people who are different from us? Bonilla and others have done some research on that white people often report that they have very close relationships with people of color. Back to that, my best friend is Latino, or my sister's married to an Asian man, or whatever that looks like. But often those relationships lack trust and intimacy, and they're not the kind of relationships where there's a lot of discussion about race and difference. So that's kind of that shared intimacy piece. If you have those diverse relationships, are you able to talk and process and interact around issues as they arise? And I think a good example of this is this summer we had a lot of racial unrest in the Twin Cities. And a lot of people of color talked about how in their workplace, nobody would say anything. And so people were feeling incredible grief as people of color about police brutality, about the shooting of Philandro Castillo, and other things that were going on. And a lot of folks would go to their work, people of color would go to their workplace and they were deeply grieving and nobody would say anything. How you doing? Or maybe that's back to that Scandinavian piece of don't talk about it. But anyway, the idea that even if we do have coworkers and people we're close to, we don't do that. We don't say, hey, how you doing? We don't say, wow, this must be, hard for you. Is let's have lunch or whatever it is. And then the last piece of this is that oftentimes in the research that's been done about white students is that they report self-segregation or racial hostility as a barrier. So back to the why do all the black kids sit together in the cafeteria, this idea that in that school, white students might look at that and go, well, they don't want to interact with me. Look at, they only want to interact with themselves. And the assumption is they don't want to get to know me, when the reality is it has probably nothing to do with not wanting to know the white student. It has to do more with interacting with people they feel safe with, interacting with people who won't say something offensive, interacting with people who that it's safe to interact with. But this idea that sometimes white students look at that and go, oh, well, they're not including me, or they don't want me to be there, or they don't want me to talk to them. I think of our own CCC, and I think that's a great place. I think sometimes students, and maybe even those of us faculty, think that's a place where we're not able to go. That's a place for a student of color. And I think the reality is that's an excellent place to go to have some conversations about this. It's next to our office, so I stop by there all the time. And I often hear students will stop by and they'll say, hey, can you help me understand this? Or it's a place to go and talk and have dialogue and interact and be able to be who you are and from whatever background you are a part of. Okay, lastly, I want to make sure I have a couple minutes for questions, but the last piece of colorblindness has to do with limited engagement in conversations with those outside the dominant group. I hear probably the most common barrier I hear, both from adults and students, is I don't want to say anything offensive, so I don't say anything. Because I'm so scared I'm going to say something offensive. But I think the reality that we need to understand is that being silent is a privilege. And if we're silent, we can't learn. It's safe to be silent. It's safe to not ask questions. It's safe to just sort of don't say anything offensive, but then we don't ever learn. And I really encourage students, I hope you make that kind of mistake. I hope that you say something to somebody and they go, that really offends me, and then they tell you why. Because what a learning opportunity that is. And if we don't sort of put ourselves out there and take that risk, we're going to stay right where we are in that place where we're not able to move past. Another piece of that is I kind of said this, but the need to take risks. People of color in our community take risks whether they want to or not all of the time. Leaving the house sometimes is a risk for people of color. And so if you think about it, the risk of starting a conversation, asking a question, making a comment, that's a pretty small risk compared to what a lot of our brothers and sisters of color need to experience. So take risks, make mistakes, learn from those mistakes. And I think that's the important thing, is learn from the mistakes. And then finally, the limited engagement piece is often there's an avoidance of settings where white students are the racial minority. There are lots of places in this Twin Cities where students and faculty and staff can go where they are the minority. And it's interesting that some of us have been, for me, I think I was probably in my 20s before I had that experience where I was the only white person in a particular place. And I think that's important. So if we avoid those places, again, we're really limiting our engagement and limiting our opportunities to learn. So finding places where we can engage in difference and where we are the person who is the minority. And to take this a step further, are there places where we're the minority where our privilege doesn't benefit us? So sometimes some of you have been on mission trips and things where you are one of the few white people in the community, but you're very revered and respected in that community, as opposed to finding a place where your privilege doesn't benefit you. That, I think, gives us some empathy and insight into what it may be, a little piece of what it may be like to be a person of color. Okay, we just have a few minutes, but I wanted to make sure to pause and take time for questions. I'm also more than happy to answer questions via email or ongoing conversations if people have them, but any questions that I can address? Pansy.
I don't have a question, but I just think it's humbling for all of us, and I'm sure really humbling for you just to present some of this based on the research that you've done. And I know, just from knowing you as a professor and a friend, what a safe person you are on campus to have these conversations with, and how much you've encouraged me to branch out, to discover some of these things for myself and take some of those risks. And so that I just hope that some of the other people here have felt encouraged by that today, and I just wanted to.
Thank you. Yeah. And I thank you for saying that. And I mean, look around. There are lots of faculty here who, we don't have all the answers by any means, but some of us have been doing this work for a while, and we're absolutely happy to share our own, sticking our foot in the middle of it. We're absolutely willing to share, to support you. We're people you can go to and say, oh my gosh, you know what I did yesterday? I said this stupid thing. We do that all the time, and sometimes I think we can really support each other and learn a lot through that. Yeah. Any other questions, comments?
What did you say was the name of the book that you require your students to take a look at
Their ethnicity. It's called Ethnicity and Family Therapy. It's actually, I think it's on reserve at the reference desk, and it's written by McGoldrick, M.C.G. McGoldrick. Yeah, and I think it's also available through interlibrary loan as well. Yeah. Anything else? All right, well, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it. And